As a quick note, I do prefer verbal POI, so if you're asking me a POI, just feel free to unmute. The ability for a disaffected, struggling person to empathize with the concerns of the families who have lost their family members from a global pandemic is limited when weighed up against their own understanding of the devastating economic harms of lockdown visited upon them and their family members. The is that empathy is a scarce good. It extends to some over others and all too often prioritizes those who have similar experiences, reinforcing beliefs and values in such a way that furthers political polarization and willful ignorance of the suffering of those in the developing world and those in general who are in disadvantaged positions. I'm very, very proud to propose because we rectify those problems. I'm going to talk about 5 different things in this speech. First of all, I'm going to briefly set up what this debate is about. Second of all, I'm going to talk about why this fosters better empathy and understanding, leading to better results for the developing world. Third, I'm going to talk about reductions in political polarization. Fourth, I'm going to talk about how this makes people make more informed decisions in their own lives. And fifth, why this is a principally obligatory measure. In terms of the setup of this debate, clearly the counterfactual is a world in which recall does not exist. You will know in these circumstances when recall happens and that is someone else's memory. This is fairly straightforward given the fact that these are different memories. You haven't ever experienced these things in your own life. And the fact that these are powerful and vivid memories, which are oftentimes different from how you interpret your own memories, i.e. you actually lived through them. This is important because it just means that people are able to understand that this is someone else's suffering. On aggregate, I also want to point out that you're going to get significant discussion of these issues. I think that this is going to happen a few times a year for the average person. And given the fact that it's so normalized and widespread, you'll talk to your friends, your family members about it, and that will help interpret it. So this benefit is not just an individual understands the issue, it's that their entire community can coalesce and discuss upon those issues afterwards. Finally, I just want to point out that given this is normalized, people are unlikely to be deeply upset about the world in which recall exists. We think that most people end up adjusting their expectations to the status quo. So when this is normalized, it's going to be less invasive. And moreover, it means that you're more likely to get provisions for things like therapy or more education and coping mechanisms to deal with traumatic memories when that does come about. 4 arguments then. Number 1, on why this fosters better empathy and understanding, helping the developing world. The thing that I want to establish at the top of this argument is that there is an empathy gap which privileges people who are nearby based on your temporal and emotional boundaries. The fact that, for instance, your lived experiences are much more similar to someone who grew up in your hometown means that you interpret all of that empathy in a way that is favorable to those who are most similar to you. This is a problem because it means that you artificially privilege the interests of those who are nearby than those abroad. We think that personally, emphasizing with the trivial concerns of your own child who has a bad day or who might have to buy a slightly more expensive product from the lack of sweatshop labor outweighs and overpowers all the other empathetic reactions we have to understanding those who are suffering and being exploited. And that is deeply, deeply damaging. Moreover, I want to point out that empathy is one of the key things that helps to actually disprove or to mitigate the harms of having particular lived experiences, because it is a key frame of reference which changes the way in which we evaluate the different values of certain actions.
POI.
For instance, if we understand the harms, no thank you, of poverty in the developing world more, we naturally start to understand that that is a cost we need to factor in. And it isn't just a binary decision. It means that you talk about this more in political discourse, that this gets leverage in personal conversations and emphasizes the importance of our obligations to others. Now, crucially, I know what they're going to say. They're going to say it doesn't definitely mean that you get memories from disadvantaged people. But I want to point out that global capitalism has made it so that there are a caste of people at the very top who are deeply privileged, are extremely wealthy, whereas the vast majority of people in the world are underprivileged and exploited, which means that on average, what's going to end up happening is those who are privileged will have empathetic reactions and understand the concerns of those who are underprivileged just on the basis of numbers. And on aggregate, this means that A, they're less likely to funnel and support exploitative practices, but B, much more likely to support policies like foreign aid and the protection of those who are most vulnerable on the ground. Second of all, and I'll take in a moment, reduction in political polarization. After this point, I'll give you your chance. Now, importantly enough, even if you disagree with the idea that you're going to end up completely agreeing with your empathetic reaction donating, at a bare minimum, I think it means that you understand how other groups think and why they think the way that they do. Crucially, I think it means that even if you don't buy into the policies, you're less likely to engage in political polarization. Because part of what allows for political polarization is the demonization of other groups and misconstruing their intentions. For instance, the right calling all liberals baby killers, while the left says that those who are on the right hate women. We are able to cross that divide because people have a more detailed understanding of how other people react. And obviously, while it's not happening in your own country, this will happen in terms of a left-wing individual in the US getting experiences from a right-wing individual in, say, Croatia. This means that on aggregate, you're much more likely to have empathetic political decisions. I think the impact is massive because reducing political polarization stops the crazy Trump-esque violence that comes from it, but also means that compromise within parties and within legislatures becomes more possible because you don't have to appeal to the radical groups within your party. David.
If society has already come up with ways to make it less intrusive and invasive, why is it the case that it will make them more empathetic?
Because having therapy afterwards does not mean that it has no effect upon you. It just means that you cope with it. I think this must understands the impact. Our argument isn't this doesn't matter to you. Our argument is you can deal with it even though it triggers an empathetic response. Argument number 3, just in terms of more informed decisions. Trivially speaking, this helps you to understand more about the world. It helps you in understanding, for instance, the plight of someone who comes out. So if you're a gay closeted youth in a city that is perhaps homophobic, you can see how other people have experienced it on aggregate. You might see careers that you prefer. You might see lifestyles that you prefer, countries that you'd rather live in. Moreover, it also means that you can think about the ways in which you cope with things. That when other people have different experience with coping traumatic experiences, you're able to evaluate which ones work best and directly compare. This solves an experiential gap, which means that people cannot make informed decisions in their own life. I think on aggregate, this is both better on a utilitarian scale because people make better decisions, but also preserves the ability for you to consent and meaningfully with autonomy, decide what you want to do with your life and what your life destiny actually is. That's a huge benefit. It means that you get perhaps less violence against gay youth who decide that they actually now understand the risks of coming out in certain contexts where it would genuinely be dangerous, or in other contexts, people who feel more willing in coming out because they understand that perhaps it isn't as dangerous as they perhaps thought through their cognitive biases and the poor interpretations that other people level upon them. Final thing, I just want to point out that this isn't a meaningful or harmful principled intrusion on individuals. It is morally arbitrary that we currently have the experiences and memories that we have. It is not wrong to add another morally arbitrary factor on top of it because there's no reason why we ought to prefer the default. But I think that you ought to prefer us on a principled level for 2 reasons. First of all, it means that you are able to make more meaningful decisions. But second of all, we think moral equality is a default, that this redistributes experiences so that people on average have more equal lives. And there's no reason why we should arbitrarily prefer some people who are born in more privileged positions over others. As a consequence, I'm very, very proud to propose. Thank you.
I would like to thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech and now welcome the Leader of Opposition to open the case of the opposition bench in this debate. Hear, hear.
Just to check, you can hear me fine? Great. I've seen that thumbs up for like the 4th time in a row in these 2 days. Great, then PIs in the chat as usual, and I will get started in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I hate when someone POIs rebuttal I have written down like 10 minutes ago, but I'll still use it. Look, one point of external rebuttal, then onto our case why we probably solve no problems, but why you multiply harm and why it is deeply immoral to have your moral identity stolen from you. But we'll get to that. But one thing that Jason kind of fucks up here is Jason tells you in the beginning of his speech, when something exists in the world, it is normalized and the effects on it are kind of nurtured by that. He says, oh, like it will cause it will fix it with therapy, etc. I think he misses the point here. The point is that if you know people feel random memories randomly, and you know this is something that has happened and will happen, it will probably be like having a weird dream at that point, right? I think his own framing there mitigates what he is saying, because it's much harder to get that kind of critical mass empathy. Because to recognize, to get political change, you need a shit ton of voters to care about that thing, for it to even be implemented in the political programs, and for them to even hold their politicians accountable, right? So it is hard to get that critical mass because of their framing. Let's talk about solving problems. This is our case, but the integrated rebuttal. Look, I think 2 things here. One, I think that harm can be caused by 2 different things. Firstly, it's kind of individual cases, right? You have an individual criminal that decides to do something that harms another person, right? I'm not sure this is something that can be solved, right? I think that there is a certain amount of harm in the world. It's really hard to just solve it by feeling empathy for it. What's the difference though? The difference here is that now you multiply that harm, because you multiply the feelings of just before you were killed by spreading it to other people. You multiply the feelings of being raped to other people. This means that PTSD you feel, or even just the PTSD of remembering that and the memory of remembering that, inception. Look, I think that just even that kind of thing just multiplies the harm, because recognize, the Infoslide says, you feel those emotions and that reaction as if they were your own. I think that even out of the physical pain and the physical damage, you still get long-lasting damage out of the idea you have now went and felt like your own body was the one that was assaulted. You're not going to solve these individual cases. Maybe you'll get better, more stricter police, which usually helps. Yeah, sure, not really, but you're definitely multiplying that harm to multiple people. But secondly, I think this is more of their focus. They're like, oh, like structural issues, and we can solve this, right? We'll get some kind of political moving forward. I don't think so, because no one in politics currently believes they are purposely hurting the poor. Right? It isn't that the right goes on to says that poor people evil, let's not give them welfare, etc. Or that the leftists want to steal money from people because they want to fuck the economy. No, they offer different solutions. They truly believe that the job market will be better with neoliberal socialist policies. They truly believe that that's the way to get people out of poverty. That free trade is the way to get other countries out of poverty. That like giving aid is a better way to get people out of poverty. No one in politics currently is claiming that they're purposely hurting people. They just believe that their solution is the best. And that is the problem here, because empathy is not the issue. Everyone agrees that being poor is bad. The issue is that we are not sure how to fucking solve this, right? But then, what does this mean? This means that probably you do not get empathy just by itself doesn't cause any kind of change. But even if empathy were to cause some kind of change, you're still not going to have a critical mass of this. Why? Because statistically, because this recall doesn't happen every second, it means that it is unlikely that most people will ever feel something deeply traumatic, right? You'll probably get a random memory of a person going to work, or a random memory of a person just waking up. You do not feel the oppression then. You do not feel that impact. This means that maybe even some people have more empathy. A lot of them never get to experience this. But here's the point. This is where we get to the second part of our case. And this is that, let's say you are able to do this. Let's say that you get some kind of empathy, and let's get that empathy actually can create political solutions. One, it is immoral to push a moral obligation on someone who might not be able to fix it. What do you mean by this? Even if, let's, for example, I don't have empathy and I feel that someone is suffering from hunger, or that someone is working in a shit factory somewhere else. What am I going to do now? I'm already voting. But I do not have the money to stop buying shirts in Zara. I do not have the money to start buying food that's of a higher quality, right? I do not have the political power to influence everyone around me. What does this mean? You have now imposed a feeling of moral obligation on me, a feeling that I have to help someone out there in the world who I have no proximity to for harm for me. And we believe there's a significant burden on the side of the government to prove that I, as an individual, should sacrifice my own well-being for the small possibility of harming someone. Before I go on, closing government.
Like moral obligation is just a term you've made up. Why will people feel a moral obligation? Like, why are we imposing anything?
If they do not feel a moral obligation to help, open government doesn't have an impact because they will not change politics. If you have a different impact, we'll have a short diagonal going to the final. Look, let's then get into the different kind of part here. And this is something that the government doesn't think about. The question here is, for every single victim, there is a perpetrator. For everyone who's oppressed, there is an oppressor. What does this mean? Imagine getting a memory from someone who has committed a crime, from someone who is oppressing someone. If you're a random person, this can be problematic because it's not going to, by the same mechanism of empathy, you're going to get it from their position. Because if most people believe they're doing the right thing, you now recognize why they believe they were justified in doing this. Realize how fucking problematic is that you feel justified that you killed someone or that you raped someone, but that's the emotions as you interpret them. And this goes to the second thing. I believe that it's an assault on your identity. It's not that it's intrusive, but it's that we define ourselves on the basis of our moral decisions. I'm not Petar because I just woke up. I am Petar because I have firm beliefs that make me as a person. I believe that there is a right and a wrong, and I try to do right. At the point where I am forced to feel joy from something I believe is deeply immoral, you're taking that away from me. Because you're taking away my autonomy to have my identity and base it on my moral compass by imposing something else on me. Here's the problem. I don't say this happens often, but I say when it happens often, the harm is immeasurable because you now took the one thing everyone has. Because outside of physical harm and utilitarian harm, you took my identity, my right to be me and to have my own moral decisions. And further on, just one thought for the end. Imagine you feel the perspective of raping someone when you are a rape victim. Then this impact is even further exemplified. Please vote opening opposition.
I would like to thank the Leader of Opposition for that fine speech and now welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case of opening government in this debate. Hear, hear.
Can you hear me? Okay. So opening opposition's case basically implies it's morally wrong to see poor people because it creates moral impetus to help the poor. I'm not sure how well that's going to run in this debate, but let's reframe this debate and make sure what we mean by our framing. This is prefers a world motion. So it's normal this happens. That means you don't think of this as a huge intrusion of your life because you're accustomed, nurtured in a way that you know these things happen. That doesn't mean that we don't have our effects compared to how things are done right now, because their argument goes, if people normalize we are empathetic to others, then people are not empathetic to others anymore. And that's just not how the logic goes. Because if it's normal that you feel empathy to others and the connection to others, it doesn't have to be a common thing. And that because of this, you don't no longer feel the empathy. It's just that objectively, because of the mechanism that we provide, the empathy level goes up. But on a comparative, this doesn't happen to the same extent with the intrusion level because this is also normalized. So their argument can say all of the people here have more empathy. But that doesn't equal the way that doesn't equal the conclusion that now people are going to be equally willing to help, right? Because they still have a higher level of empathy as to the counterfactual. So they need to engage with this, but more so the engagement with moral responsibility and proximity. Look, people feel responsible to people who are proximate to them. This is a status quo bias. We are making you more proximate to other people who are also humans. This is a way of creating global accountability and care programs that humans have already tried to co-opt with, but we have objective problems of not being able to relate to people who are distant to us because we don't have interactions. We solve these problems. What's the proof that people inherently want to do this, but they don't have the means to actually achieve this? Humans have done this through global cooperation, concepts of global peace, global warming, concepts we extend to animals and animal rights just because they are animals. If we are giving them another mechanism of being able to put this on the next level, that is not inherently wrong, because even with the mechanisms that we have at our disposal right now, we are trying to do the best in terms of achieving these goals in the status quo. But let's talk about what the comparative really is in this debate. Comparative is you always get a told, washed out, produced experience of other people, cultures, and memories. This is true in all sorts of circumstances because you never read the person's memory in and of itself. So this is also true with your friends, unless unless you actually have the ability to see what they think and to see through their words, which might be misleading. This is problematic because you do not know epistemically to what extent this was altered by actors you have no influence on, which means that you are always burdened by co-interaction rather than actual interaction, because all perceptions of other beings that you have are necessarily under the influence of people and media, and the way, not media in terms of just media, but how other people have told you what has happened. This is a unique way in which you actually, from your perspective, are able to epistemically acknowledge what other people feel without anyone or any sort of other mechanism tainting into their, into the connection between this happened to a person and how I received it in my head. This is a benefit in of itself in mutual understanding between people. But comparative is that most memories are not extreme memories, and those fall on the outliers of distribution. This means that first, that to argue for this to be the deciding factor is to undermine the totality of human interactions, which is not about you being a rapist or rape victim, but like other in-between non-criminal, if you want to go even wider and take wider, like bad experiences or bad perpetrators that can happen, interactions that happen for human beings. It's also highly unlikely that these like radical crimes will be chosen on random for a lot of people by the algorithm, which is going to prioritize the totality of human existence as a whole. What does that mean? That means that the radical experiences, which even if we consider mostly painful, like assault, failure, disappointment, are maximized in exposure, meaning there's a self-regulating mechanism of this in society that can do anything, and the society is more likely to do anything that that stops these radical outliers from happening more, because the society or the general population has exposure to these radical outliers more. So even on that perspective, I think that they're actually arguing for why our mechanism on why people would change their opinion is right if they want to go with the radical stuff. But so more common things are crowding out your judgment all of the time. I would say this is a healthy way of thinking about other people, because people inherently, because of how they are and the way of pinkwashing their life to you, are always telling you that their life is different to what they actually feel and are right now. So this is important for your average interactions right now. It doesn't necessarily matter that much if you are connecting to someone from, I don't know, Africa or Europe or Asia, whether you're poor or whether you're like rich. This is an inherent tool for you to actually see how other people feel and how they think about things, and that they also have like worries in their head, that it's not always great. This is especially important because nowadays all of us, and I mean all of us, and mostly people who are young in this room, are on the exposure of the opposite thing. This is when you look into social media and you have people's memories through this. These are oftentimes the best memories that people have, that they choose to put out. And this is what you measure your life comparatively to. So if we normalize the idea that you have normal experiences, everyday experiences from other people and their lives as well, this is a regulating mechanism to the idea that people in general all of the time tell you good things because they want to feel good about themselves, or because they don't have the guts, or they don't want to harm you, or they don't want to put emotional burdens on you. So when you compare your life to other people, you get this better on our side of the house. Lastly, I want to talk about consent, but before that I want to ask Xiao for POI.
Sprem, you're a neoliberal. What do you think about poor people? Should they suffer?
The fact that I'm a neoliberal doesn't mean that I cannot have empathy. It's just that I think that your communist way of solving things are not effectuate in actually providing people the means to live, right? So if I increase my empathy, that just means I'm going to care more about rethinking whether my neoliberal approach is good in solving people's harms, right? So very bad of you that you assume that neoliberal people have no empathy. Okay, consent of people. First of all, you are nurtured and natured after some time to accept your memories have been exchanged. So this is not that much of a problem for you, because this is how you were born, and like from the very beginning you do so. But second, you have access to other people's memories. So consent solution is symmetric to all individuals. If you prove that more individuals have benefits from this, and the consent is symmetric because you also get memories from other people, I don't care that 5% of people are going to not consent to this. That's not how you weigh consent in these sort of situations, which is symmetric to all of the people, and is something that which comes before they're even have like able to think about whether this is good or not. But also your privacy is respected, and people can find out if this was you personally who witnessed these experiences. It's highly unlikely out of 7 billion people, your best buddy is the one who's actually going to get memories from you. But also the repository of your human interaction is necessarily infringed by your interaction with people. And necessity to share things and memories and feelings in the status quo is something which also comes on our side of the house. But lastly, people consent to more and more sharing of their lives as a trend and norm, even without the normalization that necessarily happens in this case with things like social media, etc. This is the epistemic, or like the concrete evidence that we have that people would be willing to consent to this. That's it.
I would like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech, and now welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition to close out the top half. Hear, hear.
Can you hear me? Okay, so please write down POIs in chat. After the 5th minute, feel free to unmute yourself. Before I begin, just a small warning, I will be talking about quite difficult issues such as assault. I will try to be as sensitive as possible, but still. So starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Notice that Sprem loses the second he answers his POI, because neoliberals might care about poor people, but in the end their policies harm them because they believe that their policies are right. They believe that their policies are help. And even if they have empathy on their Sprem side, they will still implement these horrible policies for poor people because they believe that they are going to help them. Notice the entire analysis of 1.5 minutes from Petar's speech, where he talks about not having a consensus on change, or even if we have it, we can have bad decisions regardless. So it is not only about feeling empathy, but the idea that in order to solve these issues, such as huge poverty, such as the issue of discrimination, we need to have a common policy and a common idea of what we need to do in order to actually help these people, how to redistribute resources in order to do anything. If we cannot agree, as Sprem himself admits, then we cannot solve these issues. Then the only impact the side of the opening government has has is people being empathetic, i.e. people having significant harm if they have trauma or living through these bad instances, and having no significant change because we can simply not solve this issue. So one small piece of framing and then we go on. Okay, so because you feel these emotions as well, it is impossible to completely distance yourself from them, because you, even later on in your life, will remember the reaction you had. So you had joy, you had pain, you had stress, you had terror, etc., etc. So your body yourself felt it. And even if you rationally know that it's someone else's memory, you will unconsciously remember it as your own. So within time, you are going to have to cope with it and saying that I'm a person who doesn't want to feel this way. I'm someone who doesn't want to promote harm to someone else, or I do not share these moral beliefs, but I still felt this horrible, horrible thing, which I can never hope. Imagine being, so this comes to my speech and why this is specifically harmful. Imagine being a sexual assault victim who has to suffer through living to the experience of a man who sexually assaulted someone. Of having that, like I say, enjoyment or whatever the hell these people feel, but at the same time trying to reconciliate it with their pain, with everything that happened to them, and their own moral compass, which says this is something that can never happen. Now, I ask you one very simple question, and I don't think there is an answer from the government bench here. How do you live with yourself at that point? How do you survive day in and day out in feeling enjoyment in something that brought you immense harm? I say you can't. I say this is such a significant harm for even one individual, because we do concede this is quite unlikely, that this individual should never be allowed to suffer through this. And this leads me to my principle, and thank God for teaching me how to actually do a principle. This is the idea that your own fundamental beliefs, your moral code, the way you feel, the way you react to things, and the way you actually consider things are a crucial part of what makes you human. They're not only a crucial part about your identity, but it's the one thing you can always rely upon. So if I'm a Christian, I will likely always rely upon having a similar moral reaction to different things. If I'm a good person or believe myself to be a good person, I will always be outraged at something that is bad. So this is a core part of what makes me myself. This is something that allows me to go through the day and saying, whatever happens, however hard my life is, I am still myself. The decisions I feel, the things I do, and the things I feel are what is me. Now, what happens when you take this away? You fundamentally force people to not have a concept of themselves anymore, because they are a jumble of emotions, a jumble of experiences and moral beliefs that they held at different points of recall memories, which then they need to, let us say, get together in their head in order to understand who they as a person are. So I think that principally, not even talking about the practical part, but I'll go into this in a second, this is simply unjustifiable regardless of the benefit. Because this does not allow you as a person to create your preferences in what you want to do, to choose which things are important to you. Because at one point you're a radical Christian, or a less radical Christian. At another point you're a Muslim. At a different point you're an atheist. So these are completely different belief sets, wishes and demands, and different interactions in the way you interact with people. So what this makes is unable for you to have agency as a person to actually decide what you want to do, what your fundamental set of moral beliefs is. Now, even putting this aside and not forcing people to deal with this jumble of emotions, three very clear practical harms. One, it's not only about sexual assault victims. There is a lot of bad things going on in the world. There are wars, there are torture, there are people that simply abuse others, who insult others, etc. These are all things a significant amount of people can never actually believe themselves in doing. However, they're forced to live through this and to have this trauma with themselves for the rest of their lives. So not only do some people have the trauma of being victims, once again not responded to in Petar's speech, but moreover, we force individuals who are already victims to suffer even worse and not reconcile this. Two, we say that when you're unable to form your own identity, you become fundamentally unsure of yourself. You're unsure as to what you want to do, how you want to act. I talked about this already, but what is the consequence of this? I think the most basic thing is generally not being sure as to what you want to do in life, how you want to react, which influences your day-to-day decision making, because you're never sure as to which part of your identity is actually true and which memory or which feeling or which thing I have is not. So this means that from a day-to-day perspective, it's very hard to make these decisions and hard to act. Secondly, what I say is that generally the idea of a non-enemy that Durkheim invented or discovered is the idea that when you're unsure of yourself, in general, you're less likely to have a desire to live because you're unsure what brings you this joy. You're unsure what to pursue. You're unsure how to fit into society, and you're unsure what to do. So this, in the end, also, well, statistically proven, everyone knows this experiment, leads to people having more suicide rates, having more trauma, and having a worse off lives in general. So in the end, it's very simple. On a principle level, we cause individuals who have likely suffered the worst in this life potentially more harm for a policy change that is never going to happen or is quite unlikely. We cause an identity issue for everyone, and we fundamentally undermine what it means to be human. So this is what the government bench stands for, and this is why you vote opening opposition.
I would like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that fine speech and everyone for a very interesting top half. I would now like to welcome the Member of Government to open the closing half of this debate. Hear, hear.
I assume I'm audible. POIs in the chat, please. All right, I'm just going to get into it, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Look, I'm just going to get straight into our extension. We're going to add, I think, a lot more clearer mechanistic material about how we actually achieve change, but a good portion of our extension isn't even predicated on that happening. We think we get some clear benefits anyway. So the first thing I want to establish is what is, I think, a far clearer pathway to getting change than anything that has been established in the top half thus far. Opening government relies on people receiving these memories and therefore changing their behavior and acting for good. Opening opposition points out that there may be some instances where people don't engage with this. I think on balance, opening government are right, but we give you a plausible mechanism which is far more skeptical and works if you believe that people are fundamentally selfish bastards, which we think a lot of people are. And that mechanism is very simple. It is, you know, at any time, you may inherit someone else's bad memory. That could be something from anywhere in the world, it doesn't matter. And that fear means you have a very clear incentive to try to minimize the risk of that occurring to you. And you'll probably think about this, right? Because you will, for example, have you will see examples of friends and family, of which this is occurring to them. And this is something that will be on your mind and you will think about. So when it comes to, so for example, if you have a family member that has inherited a memory from someone who is, undertaking a war in another country, then that would be something that you would think about. And therefore, for the very selfish incentive that you don't want this to happen to you, you'll probably lobby governments, you'll probably invest in charities, you'll probably do a whole heap of things in order to minimize the chance of that occurring. The question I want to ask now, which you're probably thinking is, well, why doesn't it incentivize bad behavior on the flip side, i.e. the idea that you might lose self-inflicted bad memories that you are responsible for? The reason for that is simple. You still have an incentive to avoid the short-term harm, i.e. the recent memory of that bad behavior. So I just think at the top of this speech, this is the clearest pathway and mechanism for achieving good in the debate. I think this engages with what opening opposition challenges us with, and I think, overcomes opening government on that basis. I also now want to look into a secondary point, which is just like why this is good in and of itself. And, I think this is just an exceptionally obvious point, but one that the front half doesn't talk about, which is that accruing good and bad memories is just exceptionally arbitrary, right? You were born into a different country. You didn't choose that. I hate to use like generic lottery of birth shit, but this is, what is the case here. People are born into states they didn't choose to be born. They didn't decide where they were born. And, whilst people do have some personal responsibility for their behavior, I would suggest in the vast majority of circumstances, people are not responsible for it because they did not decide the neighborhood they grow up with. They didn't decide the educational attainment they were getting and so on, right? They didn't decide what government they would inherit. All this policy means is that more disadvantaged people now probably have some chance to get some better memories now. They will inherit happy memories that come from other people. And Op might say, but it's random again, like you might inherit bad memories. I think, again, the status quo reflects a fairly unequal environment, one where comparatively there is far more suffering. This is likely to see people who come from more disadvantaged backgrounds at least get some benefits from people who have had the benefit of far more privileged upbringings. And again, I would posit that this is the clearest benefit in this debate, because this is not reliant on having to prove any behavioral change from people whatsoever, whether you think they do so because of empathy or because they're selfish bastards. So that is important in this debate. Now what I want to do is engage with some of the material that opening opposition give us and respond to them. So the first thing they say is that this is bad because it multiplies harm, because it accrues to more people. No, that's not how this policy works. So I'll paint you a picture. Let's say you inherit a bad memory for 24 hours. That is a recent memory. Then it is distributed to someone else, and then they get that memory for the rest of their life. The total time in which it has affected people is the same. It has not multiplied, and there's no reason that that is necessarily worse because it's accrued over 2 people. The amount of harm that they feel is the same, right? So I just think that is a silly point. Then opening opposition tell us that this harms your identity. I would just posit that the way in which identities often manifest is you have a memory and it sits with you and you internalize it for a long period of time. I just do not think in the vast majority of circumstances, identities are formed on the basis of recent memories. And that's the rebuttal response that opening government misses. This is a debate about recent memories, not memories that you've had for a longer time and are likely to permeate into your identity in that particular way. On consent, opening government make the good observation that memories are a bit random shit happens to you all the time. I would also observe, one, your brain arbitrarily chooses to process things differently sometimes. So how memories form are even more arbitrary on that basis. But also note that this is a supernatural force, right? Like no one has access to what this force is. We can only guess. It could just be like completely random, a higher power or whatever. But the fact that that force exists necessarily presumes there is some sort of purpose for this that probably overcomes any notion of consent. The final thing in response to opening opposition is the idea of choice. They're like, it is bad, you lose control. This like ill-equips you for choices that you may want to otherwise make in your life. Like the fucking comparative is that things happen in your life all the time that are unexpected. Like, why is that any different to you having to restructure your life because COVID hits? I just am unclear why having to make different decisions sometimes is a harm. Opening opposition, go.
Notice the info slide says it makes a copy and implants it in you as a person. This means that this memory stays with you for the long run from the info slide. You cannot get out of this.
I agree. I'm not sure how that's a contradiction to our case. I'm a bit confused. I guess you can have another go later. Okay, the final thing I want to do is, again, I already think we've proven a more plausible mechanism, and I already think that we've proven a benefit that is not contingent on behavioral change. But I still want to have a crack at painting you a picture of something that I think opening government doesn't really do that well. So they kind of say you get empathy, you get political understanding, et cetera, et cetera. But I want to describe how that process will probably actually happen. I think a fair interpretation of this motion is that, yes, you experience it the same, but it still hits you at a certain point, right? Like you still, like let's say you're walking down the street, you get the memory, right? Even if this occurs at a larger scale and is normalized, it would probably still be a little bit weird. And I think you would then be curious. You'd want to find out, like, where is this person's memories from? You would feel it and it would feel real in the same way that you feel real, like, in virtual reality or something, but it would still feel like, I guess, something that is quite unique. And I think the process of trying to understand that is the process that leads to the empathy that opening government hint at. For these reasons, very proud to propose.
I would like to thank the Member of Government for that fine speech and now welcome the Member of Opposition to extend on the opposition bench. Hear, hear.
Hello, am I audible? Okay, lovely. Okay. Starting my speech. Oh, I'll take POIs in chat. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So we will answer two very basic questions in this speech because we think these are the things that kind of fall out of top half but are kind of necessary to resolve. First is, why is it the case that empathy is the default? Given that opening opposition doesn't answer this, and kind of the deadlock in top half relies on whether or not people would do good independent of this policy, then it is the case that by explaining that empathy is default, we resolve most of the mechanistic concerns of opening up. Secondly, we're going to explain why, even if there's arbitrariness present in society, which is most of Gov's challenges towards ops principle, we will explain why adding more arbitrariness is bad, but an additional point as to why this particular form of arbitrariness is uniquely bad compared to everything else. Okay, let's move into substantive. Responses integrated. So the first thing is simply explaining to you why empathy is the default and why the vast majority of people do not have access to this empathic option. There are 4 structural reasons. The first is because biologically, we evolved to prioritize caring for other people. It was a socially advantageous thing for communities to stay together and to stick together. So it was something that evolved through us evolutionarily. It was something that stuck basically in our DNA. Secondly, socially, it's a marker of goodness and value. It's a way of saying it's a good thing to do. It's a way of saying you're a good person. So it's something that people aspire to do because they want to be seen as good people. Thirdly, culturally, it's heavily ingrained into us. It's why there are so many people that are working in like charities for like and working in terrible jobs, even though like realistically speaking, they would probably not want to be there if they were purely selfish. But fourthly and lastly, Gov does just admit it to us. Like they admit that we attempt as much as possible to make life better for others already in the status quo. They already attempt as much as possible. So it's clearly, if it's the case that people are already trying as hard as possible, it cannot be the case that we need to have more empathy in order for you to have these solutions. So what does this mean for the debate? So I've explained very clearly why empathy is the natural default. The first is their point then on people getting used to this empathy, of people getting used to these actions, is one, more likely to desensitize them to the actual quality of empathy because of the fact that they have no control over these things. They're forced to experience these things often. Like in fact, every year it's like heavily ingrained in the discourse, as opposed to something that you should consider specially and something that should be kind of compartmentalized as something that you should specially consider, as opposed to something that's always kind of constantly running in the background. The second thing is it reduces the value of their impact, because if it is the case that people are already used to things in status quo, it cannot be the case that the problems in status quo are so bad that we need to massively inject memories into people's heads in order for it to be the case that people can solve problems in their world. Thirdly, though, if it is the case that arbitrariness doesn't matter because lots of other things are arbitrary, then it cannot be a bad thing to prioritize people that are proximate to you. In fact, there are 3 reasons why it is considerably less arbitrary to prioritize people that are proximate to you. The first is because you are likely to see the consequences of your actions. You're likely to feel better about the fact that you're doing good things to people that you can see, but moreover, people that you can interact with, people that are in your community. OG says it themselves. You will never see these people in your life. So it cannot be the case that doing good will derive some value for you as an individual. Secondly, I also want to point out that that if you benefit and prioritize people proximate to you, you yourself can benefit from these things and begin to uplift yourself from poverty and begin to uplift yourself from the problems that you are experiencing. On their world, you put people in a no-win situation where they either prioritize themselves, which is a fair thing to do, and feel constant guilt at leaving all the people that they have memories of left behind in the dust because they simply wanted to have more money for food, to put food on the table for their kids, or to just have money to go to school. So it's in their world where they make people face the moral consequences of not doing anything good without having any of the goods that come from making something happen. So this all happens, and for this reason, then we're probably winning over top half already. I admit that we're not engaging with CG yet, so here's the engagement to CG. The second, and it'll come in the second argument, but the first argument's concluded. The second argument is, why is this a moral harm? So this response to the response CG gives, which is arbitrariness is not bad, like you're already acclimated to this. The first thing is, it's not the case that just because you're acclimated to something does not mean that you feel great moral like oppression from it, that you feel like terrible about it. First of all, like their arguments already prove this. Like if people are already acclimated like wage slavery and like global capitalism, it doesn't mean that people still don't feel bad about it. So it can be the case that you feel quite aggrieved over the intrusion over your memory. You can feel quite aggrieved that it was random, so you had no choice over it. Whereas your friend got like the memory of like playing in the field full of flowers. You got the memory of someone being beaten by their boss, right? So that's one thing. That's one reason as for why this particular form of arbitrariness is still something that people would care about. Like other examples might be people still rage against death, people still rage against cancer, even though these are things that are in status quo and are like permanent fixtures of society. But the second thing, and here we're going to explain why this is considerably less arbitrary than other things. First, because you have a form of choice over the memories you consume. It's not the case that you don't have any control over your memories in your brain. You can take actions to do things to prioritize memories that you want. Like that's why you go to festivals. That's why you go to movies, because you want to remember these things, because you think these things are cool, because you have some agency over your actions. Now you have considerably less agency over the things that you experience or the things that you tackle experientially, for the reason that you basically have no agency, for the reason that it's random. The second thing is that you also have choice over the memories you choose to emphasize and make central to you. So it can be the case that you might not have any control over certain memories. It can be the case that you don't have control because you're forced to work in a shit job and you don't like what you're doing. But you can choose not to prioritize these things. You can choose to not make them the center of your identity. You can choose to make the 1 hour you spend with your son, the 1 hour you spend doing something you enjoy, the thing that is central to you, because you have the capacity to choose and rationalize between these memories. It is the loss of control as well as the forced visceral experience imposed onto you that makes it impossible to make these choices. But thirdly and lastly, because it is the case that we're making the choice. So even if it's the case that people at the bottom, like people in this motion, don't care about it, we care about it. And from the perspective of the average reasonable person in like the status quo in the society we live in, it will be a bad thing to add additional arbitrariness, for the reason that if we think arbitrariness is a bad thing because it's literally senseless, because you can't contextualize it, because you have no control over it or agency over it, then it cannot be the case that it's it cannot be the case that it's a good thing because the people down there don't care about it. From a third party perspective and as judges, it is the responsibility of us to take this from our own moral frameworks. Before I move on, I'll take a POI from Lovro.
So you say people will respond with default empathy, or says people will respond with deep trauma and nothing changes in empathy. Which one of you is right?
Well, I'm engaging. You guys are saying people will respond with empathy. OO's kind of being uncharitable. They're like, no, people will be oppressed all the time. We're saying even if they're not oppressed, which is probably the majority case anyway, it is probably the case still that they are already empathetic and you make life worse for them. Anyway, capping off this argument, here are a few other harms that result that opening opposition does not consider. The first is just the total lack of privacy. So I want you to consider living your entire life knowing that every moment has the potential to be cast adrift into the sea of minds. Someone seeing your deepest and most intimate moments with another person. Someone seeing something that you're tremendously embarrassed about. Someone seeing you do something that you might never you might want to not be representative of yourself. It is not just the harm that you are receiving someone else's memories, but that you have a total loss of control over what goes on in your life. So it might be the case that it might be potentially normalized because you don't feel it's intrusive. That doesn't mean that it's not intrusive. That doesn't mean that people still value keeping things secret from one another. But moreover, the reason why we think this is broadly important as a separate consideration from identity is because even if it is the case that you have no control over what goes on in your life, you ought to have control over what other people know about your life. You ought to have control over what people know about your secrets, of what people know about your darkest desires and your dreams. And it's for this reason then that even if it is the case you don't believe anything else the ops told you, you still win on a moral basis. And it's for this reason you must negate. Thanks.
I would like to thank the member of opposition for that fine speech and now welcome the government whip to summarize this debate for the government side. Indeed, the recording should be paused. I'm still seeing. I would like to thank the government whip for that fine speech and now welcome the opposition whip to close out opposition bench and this debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
Hello, testing on microphone. Can I be heard properly? All right, sure. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name is Luigi. My preferred gender pronouns are he, him, they. If you have any POIs, you can raise it in the chat. So I'm going to watch a chat for all of your POIs. All right. Okay, the chat is open. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, and go. Donor fatigue exists because of the learned helplessness that is developed when you believe that your efforts towards a charity, towards activism, as a person are not meaningful, they're not fruitful, or are useless in the greater scheme of things. All of us here, supposedly, in terms of a moral sense, should be giving all of our pockets worth of money towards giving it to malaria nets. But in the greater scheme of things, we're here debating with one another with no purpose, with no meaning. We care for our families, we have our own relationships, we have our own jobs, but all of these things are meaningless in the greater scheme of things. Our case at closing opposition is simple. Because these disruptions towards your everyday life that these memories introduce are short-term and random and uncontrollable, these are precisely the reasons as to why they are taken out of context. They are ineffective at developing a direction for your own activism, and they do lead to desensitization and inaction, and they do make you incapable of feeling justified in living your own lives. So that's what I'm going to focus on in today's speech. 2 issues. Number 1, what does this world look like? And 2, the principled weighing as to why we win. Number 1, what does this world look like? So let's take a step back. Because government operates on the mechanism of people feeling the visceral feelings of the randomness of these memories that happen in a short-term, regular basis over and over again, like randomly and separately among different communities, among different individuals. So everyone has their own memories that they also define for themselves related to some other person across the world. Then we say they will be pulled in multiple directions that lead to unsustainable activism. And the question I want to ask then is, why does the short-term recency that CG talks about in this debate of empathy that they are getting is incompatible with long-term structural change? So we complete the argument of opening up. 3 things that David brought to you that were unresponded to. Number 1, most of people's everyday, think about the average reasonable person, everyday activities may actually incrementally contribute to making the world better, but not in a direct manner. For example, working in your job, being able to improve a skill for yourself, paying taxes, maybe improving your own life by learning in class or participating in education. All of these things may be things that you may not expect to make the world a better place, but obviously you have to believe that they're doing something to make the world change in some way, and you have to believe that there's some distance with you and everywhere else in the world so that you can believe you are justified in being able to do those actions. So following the mechanism of Gov and the short-term randomness and the recency of all of these events, remember, these are recent, therefore it's very, very difficult for you to constantly believe that there is progress that you can track. Your life and everyday activity is always disrupted, and it leads to choice paralysis. It leads to you gaslighting to yourself that you are disrupted, that you are probably not justified in doing the things that you are currently doing, that you probably should pour your money into charity, you should do radical actions to probably change it. But again, even if you try that, you might not feel justified in doing that because more and more memories will pour in and in and in. So I want to just reconcile this incompatibility that CG says with OG, because if CG says you'll go and be curious and get more information, then the memories just aren't visceral enough for you to be able to understand how the world can change that in a meaningful way if you want to stop the next memory or the next memory next week or the week like 3 weeks afterwards, because there are more people that will still be suffering. So because of this, we complete the argument of opening up that it does multiply in some particular way because it disrupts your life and it stops from being able to be justified in your actions. Number 2, if you do your actions, then you may have, you may be put up and be worked up in being able to work towards this own direction. So obviously, people privilege their own experiences, their own memories over others. You might believe that some causes are more important than others because of a recency of this memory or some suffering of another individual. And therefore, to some extent, to some degree, some priorities and some charities will be given more weight over others, and some other individuals will also believe that they're unjustified in believing that certain causes are more important. So to some degree, their experiences and the empathy gap that they are trying to bridge actually divides many of these social movements against each other. But 3, you feel disproportionate responsibility for every single dose and every single memory that you are given. So I want to understand the best case of opening Gov, where everyone is connected and they feel that they are really, really experiencing every single memory. It really, really makes you feel like your activism is probably irrational, that your daily life, every activity that you are doing is also irrational, and therefore you cannot be able to act in a proper manner that is best for the world. This is why David's comparative of default empathy that already exists is good, and it outweighs closing Gov and OG. Because if closing Gov wants more information, there are already incentives for people to get that when they feel there is distance with other people across the world. That distance is so important for you to develop some activism for yourself, because you can still believe some things like my family, my proximate relationships are meaningful, but they contribute to something to make the world a better place for my own community. And that might be a really great thing in a grassroots movement type of sense, like, voting for the Democrat Party, but it's never going to be enough if you are always thinking about every single memory that CG and OG does, because of the fact that people will always constantly be reminded and berated every single time of all those traumatic experiences and sufferings of more and more people. This is why their empathy is misguided. It leads to more harm, and it probably says that your own care towards other people is unjustified, and therefore it's wrong. OG.
You don't need CG's only mech for rich people to fear becoming poor and supporting retribution. This motion is most exclusive on our content of reducing barriers and bias to experiencing other people's thoughts.
Yeah, so obviously you don't need CG, so they lose, right? It's okay. But basically, if you were to engage with the true case that David brought to you in today's debate, it is to say that if you have current biases towards your own community, we said that's good. That's perfectly fine to a certain degree because that also improves some people, some relationships, some ability for you to improve the world, but also allows you to connect towards other communities that also have their own charities, their own meaning, their own understandings, their own movements, other people that also have those social relationships too. Because we are social people. We will always talk to more people with more and more experiences. We will ask an activist to share their story to us because we don't have to appropriate that for them because we had their memory implanted in us. This is the difference in closing opposition. We talk about what the world looks like, and that's why in terms of principle framing, like we give you the complete understanding of how the world will function, how people will understand their activism, why the short-term and randomness of these memories just do more harm than good are in our threats to people's everyday living. Very proud to oppose.
I would like to thank the opposition whip for that fine speech and everyone in this debate for an excellent debate. Congratulations again for all teams for having made it thus far. We will give you the results in approximately whenever the schedule says. At this point, I assume we'll have a breakout room. I see it's just been opened. So until then, bye.
Thanks all for the round.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.